Hello and welcome to this presentation, which, as the title suggests, is aimed at helping everyone here at Matt Roberts to better understand the corrective strategies and philosophies that we can utilize to help clean up a client's movement when they present with red flags on the FMS. For those of you guys that don't know me, my name is Rob and I'm situated at the Chelsea branch. So if you have any questions following this presentation, then that's where you'll find me. So before we get into things, I want to make reference to the Functional Movement Systems website and the Movement book by Gray Cook, which are both resources I'd encourage everyone to use and read to continue to deepen their understanding of all things FMS. Most of what we go through today is going to be taken from these resources, so make sure you take advantage of the information that they provide. So let's get on with things. As with all assessments, there isn't much point in discussing the corrective strategies if we aren't first on point with the screens that we're doing. If you have read the two articles that I put together about the FMS, or if you've worked through the movement book, then you'll have a good understanding of that we use the FMS to establish effective movement minimums, and it's really important that we learn to perform the screen correctly. So our first goal is always to build competency in performing the screen to make sure that we provide consistent and reliable data. Outside of the logistical part of performing the screen, however, it's also important to understand some of the more common mistakes that can be made when we're trying to interpret what's going on. So firstly, we need to be mindful not to attempt to convert any movement dysfunctions into singular anatomical problems like this muscle must be tight or this muscle must be weak. It's impossible to draw these conclusions from the screen as we are simply looking at movement patterns, and without further testing, these kind of conclusions should be avoided. Secondly, it's very easy to fall into the trap of over-analysis and to get really caught up in obsessing over little imperfections. It's important to remember that we use the FMS to identify the most significant asymmetries and limitations that the participant may have, and we should let the guidelines of the screen steer us to the most obvious conclusion about their movement competency. And thirdly, and probably one of the more important considerations, is that we need to make sure that we have done all 7 screens before we offer any corrective solutions. As we'll see in a bit, the corrective strategies we employ work best if we follow the FMS corrective hierarchy, and all 7 screens need to be scored so that we can do this. So assuming that we are all very competent at performing the screens, we now have to consider what the results are telling us. If we take pain out of the equation, as scores of 0 often mean that things should be referred out to a health professional or a physiotherapist, and we only consider scores of 1 or asymmetrical scores, then that's when the screen has revealed a dysfunctional movement pattern, and these patterns should therefore not be exercised with things like load, impact or resistance. A lot of the time, exercising these patterns will be counterproductive or even causative to the dysfunction, and so it's important that for the short term we avoid doing this. So instead, these movements need to be broken down and reconstructed with corrective exercises designed to work on aspects of mobility and stability, and these will support the pattern, the complete pattern. With the right approach, you may see patterns change for the long term in a week or two, but it simply takes as long as it takes. Ultimately, it's going to be down to the selection of the most effective corrective approach, which we can establish through successful rescreening, and also how willing and engaged the client is in the whole process. So this is a useful resource that I picked up from a company called Smart Group Training, who are based in the US and who also use the FMS to help guide their programming decisions. It shows some of the considerations you may need to make when people have red flags on a particular screen. And as you can see, it's mostly kind of common sense stuff, as most of what we should be avoiding is at the advanced movement end of the spectrum. So instead, we need to try and sort of break things down a little bit, regress some of the movements to suit the client's current limitations, and whilst simultaneously trying to move them forward to a new level of movement competency. So it's not to say that we all need to be discarding our programs and going back to the drawing board. It's more a case of trying to incorporate some of these ideas into what we're doing right now. It's quite easy to fall into the trap of assuming that general kinesiological principles apply to all of our clients. So in other words, a squat is a squat, or a lunge is a lunge, regardless of who's doing it. And in the real world, this simply isn't the case. The same exercise can impose completely different and unpredictable stresses on one person compared to the next, especially if no screening has first qualified or disqualified them from a particular movement. And that's kind of the FMS in a nutshell. We're not using it as a diagnostic tool to infer a specific cause for any movement dysfunction, as this will often require further testing. Instead, we're using the screen to minimize risk with activity and to assist in the development of a corrective exercise. Making a specific diagnosis is much less important than managing risk through suitable exercise selection. So that kind of brings us nicely to the point of corrective exercise. What exactly is corrective exercise? I'm sure if you Googled it, it would probably come up with 100 different definitions, but as this slide kind of suggests, it's ultimately used to correct something. In the context of the FMS, we use corrective exercise to improve scores of 1 or any asymmetries. And once movement has improved to acceptable levels, the corrective aim has been achieved and the goal can shift towards maintenance. The corrective exercises we use may actually be the exact same movements we use for other purposes such as movement prep, and the only difference between these two situations is in the intended outcome. As long as mobility, stability and movement pattern gains need to be made, the exercise can be defined as corrective. But it should also be considered as temporary and supplementary. After movement has been restored to acceptable levels, the goal can then change to movement quality maintenance, and a new emphasis can be placed in the direction of things like physical capacity and performance. The only way we can know if our efforts are working is to recheck the screen that produced the red flag. If we see a positive change, we can be happy that our methods have created the right response. With time and good practice in and out of the gym, we can then cement this response into a long-term adaptation. If you refer back to the second article that I put together on the FMS, you may recall that I talk about the FMS corrective prioritization hierarchy, and it's certainly worth a mention again at this stage of the presentation, as it's key to driving your corrective exercise decisions. Many people will see the squat, the hurdle step and the lunge as the most important representation of function and often consider the remaining four tests as supplemental. However, the mobility tests, or the active leg raise and the shoulder mobility, along with the stability tests, or the rotary stability and the push-up, they're actually fundamental to functional movement and they should always be reconstructed first. So it's best to follow the order seen here on the right hand side of the screen with your corrective strategies and move to the next test when a minimum score of 2 has been attained in the previous one. You can work to establish scores of 3, but again it's best to do this by working on the fundamental movements first before moving on to the more advanced patterns, and obviously only when all red flags have been removed. If scores of 2 seem to be an obvious plateau, then it's a good idea to construct frequent movement preparation around these screens. So if we've done the screen and we've established the most fundamental pattern that needs to be worked on, we then need to establish our corrective strategy. I'm not suggesting this picture is the way to go, and in fact it's kind of the opposite, as the point of corrective exercise doesn't have to be something where we use all sorts of different equipment and strange positions. The exercises we use can first be defined under the broad categories of mobility and stability, And if we think of all the exercises that we currently use and place them into these categories, then we can create subcategories based on the movement patterns. Before we all start seeking new exercises, we should think about working with what we currently use and what we're familiar with. Each one of us is skilled in a particular exercise method or methods, and these methods will all have exercises that target mobility and stability. So it's best to first stay in our professional comfort zone and work to identify the methods that produce positive changes and also the ones that don't. So there's no need to adopt an entirely new approach simply because you have learned how to screen someone's movement. We just need to use what we already know systematically. Our current exercises should improve movement quality by addressing deficits in mobility, stability and movement patterns. And then our strength and conditioning exercises should build physical capacity on a solid movement base without compromising quality to get quantity. A good exercise to try is to list and find what you would use if you had to improve movement quality and nothing else. What would you choose if you had to take someone with a poor movement screen and make it better in one session? Then you take this list and you can categorize it into mobility and stability exercises and then put them into your corrective toolbox. Use the tools that you have now and add more as the need presents itself. Well, how do you know when you need to develop your corrective toolbox? Well, the best way is to don't assume anything. Always check the effectiveness of a well-executed exercise technique against the movement pattern that it is designed to improve, and then let this be the guide to your decisions. Now, there's lots of options out there for us to choose from when it comes to developing a repertoire of corrective exercises, and the point of this presentation isn't to go through all the things you might do if someone has, for example, a 1 on the active straight leg raise. If you need somewhere to start, then the Functional Movement Systems website has a library of choices that they recommend alongside the screen. But as long as you approach the corrective choices with the right investigative mindset, then it doesn't have to be an FMS exercise to fix the problem. So part of that investigative mindset should involve the approach that we need to establish mobility before we can provide an environment for an individual to relearn the appropriate level of stability. The FMS corrective model follows this theory and states that by re-establishing adequate mobility, we allow the opportunity for improved stabilization through new levels of sensory input. And this makes perfect sense, as without being able to establish the right position through good mobility, then we won't learn to stabilize in the most efficient way. So does this mean that we should always aim to get mobility first? Well, not necessarily, as this can be where things might get a little bit confusing. But this quote by Dr. Stuart McGill suggests that proximal stability, or that of the core, will unlock distal mobility, or that of the moving joints. And I'm inclined to agree. So we do need to make sure that we have mobility first, but how we get that is most likely going to require us to learn how to stabilize better through good breathing mechanics and getting the rib cage and pelvis into a better position. So for most people with really poor movement, this is going to be a really good place to start. Now, I've made reference here to the Postural Restoration Institute, as I believe that the work they do on breathing mechanics is very important. And if you want to learn more about this, then their website and home learning resources will be a real eye-opener. So I'm hoping that some of the things that we've talked about here have helped to clarify how we can use and develop corrective exercise strategies based on FMS results. Now, I'm sure a few of you have dozed off, as it's not the most exciting topic, and I can only apologise if I've ended up making things more complicated. But to simplify, all we're trying to do is manage risk whilst doing our best to get the results the client wants. Because let's face it, most of the clients don't care about their FMS score, but that doesn't make it any less important. If the screen reveals dysfunction, it implies poor efficiency, which will in turn cause premature fatigue. And it's this vicious cycle of inefficient movement and quick fatigue that creates a poor environment for improved metabolism. And for our clients, this means results are going to be much harder to come by. But at the same time, let's not forget that from a bigger picture perspective, it's only one piece of a very large puzzle that we have to try and solve. The FMS is just another tool that we can use alongside many others to guide our decisions and assist our clients towards their health and fitness goals, so that we can find that balance between giving the client what they want and what they need. Okay, so that's it for now. Thanks very much for listening, and hopefully see you soon.